about the Chagos Islands again. Do you remember a couple of months ago when the government did the deal with the Chagos Islands government, the Mauritian government over the Chagos Islands? I was a bit nervous about doing that as a phone-in because I thought, well, who's heard of the Chagos Islands? Are we going to get any calls? And we were inundated with calls, mostly from people saying, well, I don't see what the problem is. It's absolutely right that the government came to a deal. And then it all sort of seemed to unravel a little bit. And now we have a situation where the new Mauritian government says that they don't like the deal. We have the new American administration saying they don't like the deal. And you think, well, if neither of them like the deal, and the fact is it is important that the Americans are on side on this because of the Diego Garcia military base, if neither of them like the deal, is the British government going to have to back down and renege on that deal, which would be a complete humiliation, wouldn't it? Do you think the government rushed into this without actually analysing what might happen if there was a new government in Mauritius and a new government in America? Very keen to hear your views on that. Also want to hear from the Chagosian community in this country, many of whom live in Croydon. If you're listening, we'd love to hear your reaction to these developments. 0345 6060 973. Let's talk to Aggie Chambray, LBC's political correspondent. Aggie, the government seems to have got itself into a bit of a mess. Could they have foreseen this?
I'm not sure they could have foreseen this. I mean, obviously, they knew there was going to be an election in the US. They knew that there were various things they had to Trump-proof. I don't know how much they thought about this. But it does look like the deal might be in a little bit of trouble. The small print has still not been completely worked out. And Jonathan Powell who's worked on this deal, brokered this deal, has gone off for last-minute talks on this. But as you say, there's the US saying the Marco Rubio, who's Trump's pick as Secretary of State, suggested the deal would provide an opportunity for communist China to gain valuable intelligence on our naval support facility. And also at the Common Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which happened earlier today, Tory Sir John Whittingdale said that the Mauritius government weren't happy. They described, and this is a new Mauritian government, there's a new leader in place there, described the agreement as high treason and a sellout. So I think they are in a little bit of trouble here, and I'm not sure exactly what they're going to do. But, a government source, I thought this was a brilliant quote to the Times, said, "We are not trying to rush the deal. Our ambition is simply to get the deal done as quickly as possible," but absolutely not trying to rush the deal.
So they're not trying to rush it, but they're trying to do it quickly.
As possible. Exactly.
Okay, I get
that makes complete
sense, doesn't
yes.
it? Thank you for that.
Exactly.
Wisdom.
But we know that a lot is at stake here. Britain are planning to pay millions of pounds annually to continue leasing this key military base, Diego Garcia. We know how important that is. But yeah, Jonathan Powell has gone, and it's one of those things that's become a bit more difficult with this new administration coming in the US. David Lammy, I should say, the Foreign Secretary, was asked, as you might expect, earlier today when he was at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee about this. And he said, he's pretty sure Mauritius and the US are still going to back, in his words, a good deal. He described this as politicking before elections. But he thinks they're still going to back it. And as I say, the final details are still being worked out. But Jonathan Powell, who brokered this deal, is trying to sort it out and spend a couple of days working this out.
Well, the new Mauritian Prime Minister, do you know his name?
Yep, Navachandra Ragulam.
Thank you for pronouncing it so I didn't have to. He's 77.
Welcome.
That's quite something to be a new Prime Minister at the age of 77. He says that he was surprised that the deal had been signed just a month before the Mauritian general election and warned British negotiators that he reserved doubts. He said, "I informed them that I wish to have more time to study the details with a panel of legal advisors." I mean, that doesn't seem to bode particularly well. And it's Diego Garcia that, from the Mauritian government's problem, that's the issue, isn't it? Because there's a lease on Diego Garcia for 99 years, but it could be extended to 200. That seems to be the sticking point.
But I think we had this conversation at the time, Ian. I think part of the reason that they were very keen, of course, they're not trying to rush the deal, as we just talked about, but they were very keen to get this through before there was this change in government. And I guess the problem comes by the fact that it hasn't been completely signed, the small print hasn't been worked out, and this new Prime Minister, who was just elected 2 weeks ago, is, speaking out about it. And there are these words, the high treason and a sellout. I mean, that is really, really strong language. So whether or not it will fall apart, I mean, we know the Conservatives have criticised this, even though they did start negotiating this deal during the Conservative administration. It could be tricky times ahead.
It could be. Aggie, thank you very much indeed. That's Aggie Chambray, LBC's political correspondent. Now, Henry Smith is the former Conservative MP for Crawley, which is home to the UK's largest Chagosian community, and also the previous chair of the Chagos Islands All-Party Parliamentary Group. Henry, very good evening to you. On the face of it, it seems as though the government might have a lot of egg on its face if it has to go back on this deal. The Mauritians don't seem impressed by it. Donald Trump's administration certainly doesn't seem to. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, good evening, Ian. It is quite remarkable. The British government knew that there were going to be US presidential elections at the beginning of November. They also knew that there were going to be Mauritian National Assembly elections a fortnight ago, and yet they did rush this deal through under agreement with the previous administration in Port Louis, the capital of Mauritius. And they did that deliberately to try and also support that party in Mauritius to be re-elected. And the irony is that the old Mauritian government were returned with 0 seats in the National Assembly. So I do think this deal should be paused, and principally because the Chagos Island people themselves have not been consulted. Any other territory, any other British overseas territory would have a right of self-determination, whether you're Gibraltar or the Falkland Islands or wherever, to decide your own sovereign future. And yet the Chagosian people have been denied that. So on so many levels, this is a dodgy deal. It's also very questionable when it comes to security. Mauritius has been a close ally of China. China are keen to move into the Indian Ocean. And on environmental aspects as well, Mauritius has a very poor record in terms of environmental protection, and the Marine Protected Area, which was established in 2009 by the British government, protects almost pristine waters of over 250,000 square miles. So it really does need to be reviewed, I think, Ian.
Just explain the China problem here, because if Diego Garcia is leased to Britain for 99 years, why should China be a problem?
Well, the idea of leasing something you currently own is a bizarre one, and paying for the privilege. That's sort of point number one. But secondly, Mauritius is very closely aligned to China, and it be quite conceivable that on one of the nearby islands to Diego Garcia, where the main military base is, which has been incredibly strategic for the last 50, 60 years, could be used for a Chinese base or could be used to monitor US and British activity at Diego Garcia, something that they can't do right now because those outer islands are also under British sovereignty, but would no longer be if this deal were to go ahead.
In terms of the Chagosian community in this country, how many Chagosians are there, not just in Crawley, but in the rest of the country? Do we have a number?
It's very difficult to give a specific number, but we are talking about thousands of people, and the majority of which live in Crawley. I've represented the community in one guise or another last 14 years as Member of Parliament, but prior to that, I was leader of the local authority where most of them were living. And the vast majority, even though this country has historically treated them appallingly, the vast majority would far rather remain under British sovereignty than be transferred to Mauritian sovereignty. But the key point is they should be the ones to decide the determination of their homeland, not the Foreign Office in London or the State Department in Washington or the government in Port Louis, Mauritius, which is almost 1,500 miles away from the Chagos Islands.
Because when we talked about this, when the original agreement was announced, I would admit to not knowing an awful lot about the Chagos Islands. I knew where they were, but that was about it. And I was quite surprised at the vehemence of the Chagosians that I spoke to in that hour, who said they'd much rather stay under British rule than under Mauritian, than for Mauritius to have sovereignty, which I thought was a little odd, given the way that Britain has treated them in the past.
Well, it is very curious. As I said earlier on, Britain has treated the Chagosian people appallingly over the last half century, 60 years now. And that really speaks to something that the Mauritians treated them even worse when they were treated as second-class citizens, when they were exiled to Mauritius. So it really does tell you that the Chagosian people do not feel Mauritian, do not identify as Mauritian, and do not want sovereignty of their homeland to be ceded to Mauritius.
Henry, thank you for talking to us this evening on LBC. That's Henry Smith, the former MP for Crawley. We'll come to your calls on this in just a moment. It is an interesting international diplomatic dilemma for the UK government, because having trumpeted this deal only a matter of weeks ago, wasn't it, really? It wasn't that long ago. It now seems to be falling apart. Now, do you think that if it does fall apart, and the new Mauritian government basically says it's not going to sign up to it, if the new American administration puts the nix on it, where does that leave the British government? I would suggest it would leave it with a lot of egg on its face.